I can agree that the cool breeze is very welcome tonight. It's truly a blessing to have a chance to talk with you this evening. Of course, you're wondering, who is this guy? Well, I have a degree from Michigan, of course, so is a Unit of Honor. I'm the former Vice Chairman of the Meade Township Planning Commission down here, if you look at our portable map of Michigan, where we were faced with wind energy development proposed by John Deere, which then later became Exelon. We worked for 2 years. I worked for 2 years drafting the ag land preservation language for Lenawee County, and then I helped draft a wind energy ordinance that later became a state model ordinance, which you can see here on the list of many ordinances. Some of these ordinances are very restrictive, some of them are quite generous. But I was very proud to work with Foster Swift, the prominent municipal law firm, to develop this particular ordinance. By the way, I am not a lawyer, though I do watch Law and Order. Nothing I say today should be construed as offering legal counsel. Developing wind energy ordinances that can withstand legal scrutiny is a specialty. It is important to retain experienced counsel in these matters. We can recommend several upon request. I have run these slides past our own attorney in the IICC. We're all volunteers. I don't get paid to do this. I volunteered my time to come tonight. There's no charge for anybody here. So we do our best to make sure we have accurate information. I also try very hard to bring sources of information that are very hard to characterize as so-called anti-wind or pro-wind types of sources. I think you'll see that the sources I picked are easy to see are credible and neutral sources. And I would say to you, commissioners, tonight, I fully understand what it's like to sit at the table, because I sat there myself for 6.5 years, and except for the low-level nuclear waste dump that was proposed for my township, I know nothing that was more controversial than the wind project that was proposed for our area. It's nothing that you expected or asked for when you signed up for the job, so I applaud you. You guys are doing a fantastic job, and I appreciate your interest in health, safety, and welfare. I believe the good news is that reasonable wind energy zoning regulations driven by the principles of consent and compensation can place the burden of deciding whether a given community hosts utility scale wind development upon the wind developer rather than the zoning authority. That'll become more clear as I talk. This is as it should be. Now I'm going to review a couple things that aren't directly zoning related, but I read a lot of press reports out of Huron County, and I think some things could maybe stand to be clarified. I spent a fair amount of time in Lansing. I've testified in front of both the House and Senate Energy and Tech Committees in Michigan as well as in Ohio. I've given testimony in front of members of Congress in Washington, D.C. As you all may know, the reason we build wind in Michigan is because of a law called PA 295 in 2008, which requires that Michigan utilities generate 10% renewable energy from in-state sources by 2015. Though, as our DTE representatives will know, it's not really 10%, though it was for consumers in DTE. In truth, we'll have gone from roughly 4% to maybe a little over 6.5%, yet the way the RECs and so forth are counted, it adds up to 10%. So truthfully, we have not gone anywhere like from 0 to 10% renewables in the state of Michigan. But there's an issue with PA 295. This is Judge Richard Posner from the 7th Circuit, and he said the problem with PA 295 is without violating the Commerce Clause of Article 1 of the Constitution, you cannot discriminate against out-of-state renewable energy. So PA 295's requirement that Michigan build wind generation in the state is in fact unconstitutional. Most of the representatives that I've interacted with in Lansing agree with that. In fact, DTE's position, there was a recent podcast by Steve Rawlings. I think that's his picture. Forgive me if it's not. I've not met him personally. But in Traverse City, he spoke on a radio show along with consumers, Cherry Lane Electric, and Traverse City Power and Light. And DTE's position, at least as Mr. Rawlings presented, suggested that to the extent there is a mandate for any more renewable energy this next year, they want the flexibility to buy from out of state. They recognize that Michigan wind is rather expensive compared to out-of-state sources. Consumers Energy agreed that the in-state mandate is unconstitutional and could easily be defeated in court. That has an implication for local zoning. PA 295's de facto in-state wind generation mandate is unconstitutional. I would argue then that anybody that says we have to let wind in on the developer's terms or they will be forced upon us either by the state or by eminent domain, those claims are baseless. Why? PA 295 never had a rational basis in the law to force that wind generation to be built here in the first place. Further, in my interactions with Governor Snyder's office, he does not support preemption of local control of wind zoning. He made that clear in a talk that he gave in Traverse City. You can call his energy policy advisor and speak to her directly. Secondly, there's no support in the Michigan legislature for preempting local control of wind energy zoning, and of course the Michigan Township Association strongly supports local control of wind energy zoning. The idea that the state's going to take over if you don't let them in has been popular for a number of years. It just turns out to be false. Moreover, the state of Ohio has state-level siting for renewable energy, yet Michigan has managed to construct far more wind than in Ohio, and here's why. Most of the Ohio wind projects that were proposed, with the exception of Pauling and Van Wert, have been challenged by local residents in court, heading all the way to the Ohio Supreme Court. It's been very, very difficult to build wind in Ohio, despite the state having control. And state-level siting can be dangerous for wind developers. This summer, the Ohio legislature added a single line to their budget bill that moved the setbacks to property lines, which has sharply curtailed wind development in the state. My point is, if you are a wind developer and you're promoting state-level siting of wind turbines, you will always be just one vote away from having all the turbine projects taken away. So now let's take a look at Michigan's wind experience. We now have over 1,000 megawatts of wind turbines installed. The people in Huron County know that better than anybody else. Initially, you may recall, the state recommended 1,000-foot setbacks from homes and 55 decibel noise limits measured at the home. But experience has been a harsh teacher. That this is a controversial issue here is not unique or rare. It happens everywhere. We've had recalls, referenda, litigation, noise complaints. Maybe most striking is the 14 turbines in the Garden Peninsula. The 73 residents that live nearby have all sent a petition to Heritage Energy and to their county saying, can't you please stop the noise? Then there was a report that came out last fall, and my group did submit ample comments. Interestingly, Consumers Energy and Detroit Edison's comments largely mirrored ours on most areas, except in the area of siting. The state's latest publication on wind energy now references mile-and-a-quarter setbacks and noise limits below 40 decibels in hilly terrain. The article that they reference I brought to you folks tonight. You have that document in front of you. We've learned another thing about wind energy in Michigan as well. That's the state of Iowa on the left. Our wind is uncompetitive in price, and it just continues to worsen. Iowa has a lot of 8.5 meter per second wind, and Michigan has none. I don't even think we have any, scarcely any at 100 meters. Bottom line is, our best wind is Iowa's worst. What that means is, every turbine built in Michigan, had it been built in Iowa, would produce roughly twice as much energy for the same price. Worse yet, the installed costs on wind energy in Iowa are much cheaper. The submittals I see in the Public Service Commission by consumers and DTE show installed prices in excess of $2,000 a kilowatt. 2,200 to 2,500 seems to be the range. Maybe the latest generation is a little less. ALEA is reporting installed costs in the center of the nation in about the $1,300 range. Our turbines are more expensive to build. They produce far less energy. And taller turbines are not bridging the difference. The purple line is states like Iowa. The yellow line I added is roughly the Great Lakes areas. No matter the stage of advancement with really tall turbines, we're not catching them on price. The latest wind contracts, according to the latest NREL report on renewables, in the Iowa area and perhaps in Texas are in the low 20s. I think Michigan's lowest ones are in the mid 40s. And DTE and consumers and the co-ops all said that they think that wind prices are going to begin to rise. They don't think they're going to stay this low. I don't know if it was Mr. Rawlings or the fellow from CMS that said the cheap wind that was put in by NextEra was a rush to hurry up and get, quote, iron in the ground to hang on to the production tax credit, which is worth pre-tax about $35 a megawatt hour, which, by the way, is roughly the wholesale value of electricity in MISO. But finally, if you're an environmentalist and you very much want to reduce CO2 and pollutants in the air, the $2.5 billion we spent on wind plus transmission so far in the state of Michigan, at best, reduced coal emissions by 4%. Had we built combined cycle gas turbines equal to that same dollar amount, we could have cut those emissions by 50% and CO2 by 25% today, already. And the Brookings Institute just issued a report. They're a center-left leaning group. They're very concerned about global warming, but they point out new hydroelectric, nuclear, or gas combined cycle plants are much more beneficial per megawatt of capacity than wind or solar plants, with a gas combined cycle plant being the most beneficial. If you're concerned about reducing CO2, wind and solar are the most expensive and the least effective means to do so. Here's DTE's very fine plant in Newport, I think. Fermi 2, 1,100 megawatt generator. If you don't like nuclear and you want to replace that plant with wind, it could probably be done. You'd cover every square mile from Toledo to Detroit to Ann Arbor in rough terms with 2 V100 turbines, like you have maybe north of Elton. That entire region would be blanketed with turbines, and you'd still have to build a couple 500, 600 megawatt combined cycle gas plants to take care of those times when the wind just simply doesn't blow. Mr. Rawlings pointed out in his podcast that it actually is rather disturbing to him to see the plant in Gratiot at times of very high demand, like right now, and they're sitting still. All that capital that the ratepayers have helped pay for is just sitting and producing very little. Irene Dimitri of Detroit Edison said during the Proposal 3 campaign, wind in July and August gives us one big goose egg. Or consider this, 36 square miles of turbines in Meade Township. That same amount of energy can be produced by a semi-trailer mounted gas turbine that'll fit inside your average dairy barn, and for far less money. Now back to zoning. There's a lot of things we could talk about in zoning, from birds and property values. I'm only going to talk about a few. Height, setbacks, noise, and decommissioning. So here's some good zoning questions, and you folks are already well on the way down this path. How do we evaluate any product that is bought before us? Any product, something at home. Well, we look at the total cost of ownership. We need to know the price, and we need to know what we get for the money. This is something we do in our lives every day. Want to buy a car? Well, we look at price, brand, we have an idea of style and the kinds of things we like. Then we decide how much we want to spend, and then based on our past experience with cars, we say, I'll never get a Chrysler again, or I love my Ford. You know, we have a common experience with that. It's easy because we know a lot about cars. But it's much harder with turbines. When a developer says, I'm going to build some 100-meter class Vestas V100s, we now have to say, well, what's that look like? Well, in most communities, they don't know because they don't come over to the thumb very often. You folks know what we're talking about. And of course, the new turbines now are roughly as tall as the towers on the Mackinac Bridge, which you can see. And you can see this is a V100 in Consumers Wind Plant, Lake Winds. That's 1,139-foot setback to the home. These folks actually live in the basement. But curiously, and the reason you have to consider this in your zoning language is DTE's partner NextEra has applied to FAA for approval for the new 570-foot class turbines. In fact, I'm consulting with a community in Maryland that's Pioneer Green is proposing 690-foot turbines to be built on shore. I suspect that they're offshore turbines they want to bring on land. So you see, if you had 1,100 or 12 or 1,300-foot setback and the turbines like in Ubly used to be 390 and now they're 690, you got to understand that there's, the impacts are not proportionate anymore. So we're looking at our law, we're looking at things we can do as a township to regulate land use, and of course the Zoning Enabling Act is the authority that gives you the ability to do what you do in your township. And as your chairman already correctly pointed out, it shall be based upon a plan designed to promote public health, safety, and welfare. I put it this way, if the proposed activity cannot be performed in our communities in keeping with health, safety, and welfare, it must not be permitted. Remember, and I'm not singling out wind developers, this is true of all developers, a developer's primary commitment is to bottom line, and their recommendations are designed to maximize return on investment. But the planning official's single commitment must be to health, safety, and welfare. You raise your hand and swore an oath to that effect. Now, what are your legal limits? When the wind guys showed up in my township, we never really dealt with much other development with the exception of an ethanol plant. And so, like, you folks may be like, well, what can we do? How far can we go? What are our legal authorities? What are our limits? Well, the courts in general have said that the zoning regulations must have a rational relationship to protecting health, safety, and welfare. And that language must not be arbitrary or capricious. If the zoning regulation meets those criteria, it is almost unassailable in court. Remember, reasonable zoning is strong. In truth, local rule zoning at the township level is one of the most powerful forces that we have given to anybody in the state of Michigan. The township preempts the county and preempts the state. It proceeds from the state, but nonetheless, the state has chosen not to preempt local rule of these matters. You have all the power. It's in your hands. The trustee board has the ultimate power. Protecting health, safety, and welfare is the sworn duty. Developers can be crafty and present many superficially enticing arguments, but protecting health, safety, and welfare comes first. So, a couple quick questions. Are the developers' profits more important than health, safety, and welfare? Are promised increases in tax revenue more important than health, safety, and welfare? Are claims of private property rights more important? Are claims of green jobs or emission reductions more important than health, safety, and welfare? According to the oath you swore, the answer is no. Remember, It is the health, safety, and welfare, not the health, safety, or welfare. You don't get to pick any combination of the three. Too often, health and safety have been diminished in exchange for promises of jobs or tax revenue or welfare. Those promises are not binding contracts. Now, let's take a look at physical setbacks. Let's go to a couple of major turbine manufacturers and see what they recommend about physical setbacks. Vestas. If a runaway operation should occur, the plant must be evacuated immediately by running upwind, and access to the surrounding area in a radius of 500 meters must be restricted. That's 1,640 feet. Nordex. In the case of a fire in a nacelle or on the rotor, parts may fall off the wind turbine. In case of a fire, nobody is permitted within a radius of 500 meters from the turbine. Again, 1,640 feet. That's not from Windwatch. That's not from some anti-wind group. This is the manufacturer of a couple of major manufacturers of turbines. And in real life, we know this is largely true. This is a GE turbine, 390-foot class in Illinois, and the residents there reported to me that the debris field was about 1,500 feet. Now, you folks have already discussed this. I've heard in your meeting minutes. And what is typically proposed is perhaps here 1,000 or 1,320-foot setback from the turbine. Now, this circle should probably be much larger, even though the manufacturer's evacuation zone is far bigger. So in the case of the home I showed you in Ludington with the crane in the background, presuming there was a runaway operation of that turbine, the employees working for Consumers Energy would actually have to run 500 feet past the Schindeldecker's home to get into the safety buffer. Even if you move that 1,640-foot limit back to the house, as I heard in the comments, one of the problems is this person, this farmer with no contract, has lost this part of his property and can't build a second home there for his son who wants to join him in his farming operation. And the guy with the contract, you know, he deliberately surrendered that property to the wind developer. The only thing that seems reasonable, and Foster Swift's advice to us was solid on this, by moving the turbines back to the evacuation zone to the property line, everybody's rights are preserved. And you're not forcing this non-participant to donate his or her property to the wind developer to be used as an uncompensated nuisance and safety easement. About private property rights. I like private property rights. Oliver Wendell Holmes said, "The right to swing my fist, however, ends where the other man's nose begins." My corollary is if my development project requires me to repeatedly punch you in the nose, I should first get your consent and then compensate you for your broken nose. Now, how about height limits? Townships are free to regulate the height of structures simply on the basis of appearance. We can regulate a lot of things with zoning on the basis of appearance. We know that when we go to Frankenmuth. All the buildings downtown have to have an alpine theme. Are they inherently safer than buildings that aren't built that way? No. Communities get to decide what they want their community to look like. We know that because I'm betting your zoning ordinance might have a restriction on how tall houses can be in your residential district. They might limit it to 30 feet or to 2 stories. Is that because 3-story and 4-story homes can't be safely built? No. It's because your community got to decide how tall buildings you want to see. You have that authority. Wind turbines are no different than any other lawful use. You can restrict their size simply on the sake of appearance. Detroit Edison, again, Mr. Rawlings made an interesting comment in his podcast in the west side of the state. They concede, I think, in the statement there are negative visual impacts from turbines because what Mr. Rawlings said is certainly there are some pristine places in Michigan where you don't want to impact the viewshed. You take a situation like Leelanau County or the old Michigan Peninsula here in our region. Certainly there are areas where it just, while it would be perfect economic sense and perfect place for utility turbines, we probably don't want them as a region there.
Kevin, second. Could we have people please shut their phones off? Thank you very much. I'm sorry, please continue.
So it's pretty obvious to most of us that a viewshed has an impact by a 50-story tall device. My recommendations and what we did in Riga, we chose 4 times the height to non-participants' property lines and a 1/4 mile to participants' residence, with the larger setback reducible with a waiver. In other words, if the wind developer signs somebody to the project, they get this 1/4 mile setback to the residents. But for those who choose not to be in the project, we gave them a setback distance of 4 times the height. Using a multiple of turbine height rather than a fixed setback is important. Turbine sizes are increasing. Fixed setbacks don't compensate for that effect. Further, a multiple of height is much less likely to be declared exclusionary in court. It's important for the setback to not participate in the property line, or as I've already said, you're essentially awarding a free nuisance and safety easement to the wind developer. The waiver is the key to make this eminently fair and reasonable. By giving large setbacks to non-participating property lines and small ones to participants' residences, the wind developer then has to negotiate in good faith with everybody, and every member of your township can decide what price is their easement. That it's not forcibly donated by the zoning ordinance to the wind developer. It prevents the wind developer from checkerboarding certain parcels. Most wind developers don't want to lease the entire township. They want to select few parcels. And the people who are bearing the direct impact, particularly small lot landowners, are also going to be included in the process. Now, we often hear that's exclusionary, and I don't know if you've had that word thrown around here. It typically shows up. No lawful land use can be excluded when there is a demonstrated need for that use within the locality or region, unless there is no appropriate location in the area to provide for the use. I would argue that appropriate location is defined by evaluating the impacts upon health, safety, and welfare. The Michigan Bar says, look, and we can skip over this, an ordinance can arguably survive an exclusionary zoning challenge even when it undeniably prohibits a use if the use exists in nearby municipalities. Your township could decide that Chandler is enough and we don't really have to accommodate wind here, or you may decide, open it up. It's strictly up to you. But you have that authority. Many Michigan counties and townships have adopted regulations that protect their residents from irresponsible wind energy development. And irresponsible development, in my mind, is one like the Garden Peninsula, where 73 residents are signing petitions. And wind developers often state that they will sue over exclusionary zoning. They made this threat in my township. They flew attorneys in from Colorado Springs. They trucked them in from Farmington Hills. Said, this is exclusionary. If you adopt this, we're going to sue. The state says you got to have them. Truth is, as soon as the ordinance went through the referendum process and was approved 64 to 36%, they left and canceled the leases. I know of no instance where local zoning regulation of strong wind energy zoning has ever been challenged since the adoption of PA 295. That threat is routinely made, and it never happens. Not over township level or county level zoning. If it could, it would be done. Case law. Turbine height limits as short as 30 feet have withstood legal challenge in Michigan. In 2006, prior to a PA 295, a judge found that the 30-foot height restriction was not exclusionary, as the wind developer was free to build all the 30-foot tall turbines he or she desired. That's the Johnachek versus Meade Township case. Now, the other very contentious issue is noise. How loud is too loud, and who do you believe? Well, when we first looked at the World Health Organization, they looked at nighttime noise guidelines. They say a nighttime average up to 30 decibels, no substantial biological effects observed. Between 30 and 40 decibels, we'll start to see body movements, awakening, sleep disturbance, arousal. Average effects will be modest, but younger people and chronically ill people and elderly are affected to a greater degree. When you get to 40 to 55 decibels, sharp increase in adverse health effects. Exposed populations have to adapt coping mechanisms. You hear people turning on fans and air conditioners. Vulnerable groups are severely affected, and above 55 dBA, adverse health effects occur frequently. High population percentage is highly annoying. Let's ask the American Wind Energy Association's noise expert. He once testified in a paper that 45 decibel outside a home would not cause adverse health effects. Yet curiously, in a seminar he participated in, he made it clear that if it was his home in the vicinity of a wind farm, he would want the noise levels to be kept below 35 decibels, something along those lines, maybe 40, as measured outside his home. Dave Hessler is one of the acoustic consultants who does a lot of work on behalf of wind companies, including those operating in Michigan. He did a study in Minnesota, and he said, based on the observed reaction to typical projects in the United States, it would be advisable for any new project to attempt to maintain a mean sound level of 40 decibels or less. It is important to note that that level does not mean it would be inaudible or completely insignificant, only that its noise would generally be low enough that it would probably not be considered objectionable by the vast majority of neighbors. This exactly mirrors what the paper I gave to you that the state placed in their Ready Michigan for Wise Energy Decisions report. Below 40 decibels is the correct number. The science is solid on that. Rob Rand, another independent acoustic consultant, sent a paper to my township and said 45 dBA at a distance of 1,300 feet in Raga Township New England has proven that those levels are associated with widespread complaints, appeals to stop the noise, and legal action. That's particularly true in hilly terrain. Vestas, the world's now again biggest manufacturer of turbines, recommends that governments supplement relative noise limits, like those compared to ambient, with a low absolute maximum in areas of very low background, for example, flat countryside like here, which ensures minimal noise disturbance for turbine neighbors, also in each place. And this gets technical, but that means Lmax, not LEQ. I'm not going to dig deeply into the noise limits, but I would say that if you're going to consider revising your wind ordinance, as we're doing in Huron County currently, and yours is largely based upon that, you want to retain some excellent acoustic experts on this. But I'll give you a quick example of the difference between Lmax and LEQ. Lmax is like a fixed speed limit on the highway. If you're doing 60 and a 55, you get a ticket. If you told the officer, my average speed was 55 over the last hour, but it is true I did 90 for a few minutes, that wouldn't hold up because it's a fixed limit. LEQ is an hourly average. And here's why that's particularly problematic when they're measuring how quiet your township is at night. Your township around here is likely to be in the 25 decibel range for most of the night. So if the acoustician measured 59 minutes of 25 dBA, which is whisper quiet, and a car drove by for just 1 minute at 65 dBA, they just raised the hourly average to 47, even though 59 out of 60 minutes, it was actually only 25. So then when the turbine guy comes in and says, I will comply with a 45 dBA hourly average noise limit, you would presume then that since we have 47 dBA already existing, we're probably never going to hear the turbines. Except it happens quite often at times of wind shear that there'll be almost no wind at the surface, the turbines will be running, and you'll be blasting 45 or maybe 50, sometimes as high as 60 dBA noise for a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, even though your background noise is actually only 25. So these things are complicated, and it pays to retain somebody who knows what they're doing. Riley Township used a 40 decibel nighttime noise limit at non-participating property lines. We adopted 45 dBA daytime noise limits at non-participating property lines. Then we added 55 dBc low-frequency noise protection to the ordinance as well. We felt these were reasonable compromise with developers' desire and health, safety, and welfare concerns. Now we've heard some talk about flicker. It sounds like DTE has a solution for flicker, and it is true. They can program these things with pretty good certainty about where the sun will rise and fall and where the flicker events will happen. There's also software and sensor packages that can be placed on houses and will actually automatically turn the device off. In my mind, the developer should be promoting that. Technology has improved, the impacts can be mitigated, and it actually gives them more flexibility in sighting because you could actually put them a little closer, knowing that maybe most of the time will be an overcast day and the flicker sensor isn't triggered. The turbines could actually run more often. Now let's talk about decommissioning. Decommissioning is important for a number of reasons. This is a wind plant in Hawaii. And the reason I put this picture in here is, one, it grabs your attention, but secondly, I've heard some wind developers claim that you don't need any decommissioning money because the scrap value is enough to pay for them to be torn down. Well, if that's true, why did they take them down in Hawaii? I also heard a wind developer say in Ogama County that you don't need a crane and everything. You can loosen the bolts at the bottom and put dynamite on one side and it'll drop like a tree. Well, I don't think that's true either. Decommissioning matters, and it's important to have in your ordinance. Detroit Edison gave a submittal to the Public Service Commission on how long they expect the turbines to last in the Gratiot County wind plant. Their experts swore under oath that the lack of retirement data is a source of uncertainty about the service lives of newer wind turbines and their components. Every year there's a new model. They don't have a 20 or 30 year installed history to know how long they're going to last. Now he said, I would expect nearly all of the towers, and he means the tubular towers themselves, in the Gratiot Wind Park to be in service for at least 20 years. I would expect the average service life of the tubular tower itself to be 25. I expect the average service life of the rotor blades to be 20. I expect the average service life of the gearbox to be 10 years, and I believe the report said they're $450,000 each to replace when they expire. And I expect the average service life of the generator to be 20 years. Here's what you need to consider. NextEra had this presentation online talking about how the finance structure works for wind. And they point out that the majority of the early year economics for wind projects are derived from tax benefits, and you can see that on the left-hand side of the screen. Thus, since the bulk of a wind project's economic value in the early years is from tax avoidance, Most projects change hands after the initial 5 to 7 years. This means that the entity you are negotiating with today is almost certainly not going to be the one that owns the project at time of decommissioning. Ubley is already on its third owner. That may be a little different here because Detroit Edison and Consumers Energy were forced to own and operate half of their mandate. But I still don't know what will happen if that mandate changes. And Consumers has an additional layer of revenue, and Detroit Edison have an additional layer of revenue because as a regulated utility, they're guaranteed a rate of return on their capital investments. So a $250,000 wind plant will be guaranteed a certain rate of return. I think the number, at least on the one submittal I saw, is about 10.7%. So they make a substantial chunk of money. Capital investments is one of the areas that's the profits of Detroit Edison and Consumers Energy. What's my point? The production tax credit only lasts 10 years. We simply do not know what will happen to wind projects that are 10 years old and need new gearboxes and other significant capital improvements to remain operational if you can't re-up on the production tax credit. Secondly, we know that the turbines are changing in size so quickly that the existing turbine bases and the tubular towers are certainly not going to be strong enough anymore to put a 600 or 700 foot class turbine on. So those turbine bases you're probably going to have in your fields for 20 years. I don't see them being reused after that because turbine technology will have gone far beyond that. So I recommend a decommissioning bond requirement with a value determined by an independent third party selected by the municipality and paid for by the wind developer. Developer often recommends a financial guarantee. I don't recommend that because owner 2, 3, 4, 5 could end up being Billy Bob's wind farm. Where is their financial guarantees? A bond is the safest bet, but even a bond is not bulletproof because the bond company is not going to want to pay out. So I'm wrapping up now. Where from here? I've read your existing ordinance, and there are a number of serious issues that need to be modified, largely because it parallels what Huron County has in place. And they need to be modified to be consistent with the latest science on wind turbine noise, as well as the Making Michigan Ready report from the state. As presently constructed, the Meade Township ordinance requires non-participants to donate their property to wind developers to be used as nuisance and safety easements. So my recommendation would be to give you time for due diligence is to enact a moratorium. State law affords townships the ability to enact a moratorium to permit adequate time to perform due diligence. These are routinely enacted across the state, both at the township and county levels. Mason County, where Consumers Project is over there, has had a moratorium in place for the last year after the Lake Winds project went online. We did a 12-month moratorium as we developed our state model ordinance. Now, is it too late? Is it too late for Meade Township to adopt a moratorium? Fortunately, we have very good case law on this. I suggest you forward this to your corporate counsel and verify it. But the Dorman versus Clinton Township case is very applicable. To claim a vested interest in a zoning classification, the property owner must hold a valid building permit and have completed substantial construction. The fact that a developer of any kind has submitted a project for application does not mean they have a vested right in your zoning ordinance. The fact that you have even issued a building permit does not mean they have a vested right in that zoning ordinance. They have to have a permit and have completed substantial construction, largely exterior construction, which is why wind developers often want to start things like access roads. There's also another reason they like to start access roads early, because the production tax credit has expired. And the IRS has changed the way they're interpreting some of these things. So if they can show they've commenced construction while the IRS is still in limbo, they have a better chance of hanging on to that production tax credit. So they have to have a valid building permit and have completed substantial construction. Submitting documents, going to the Planning Commission for approval, even if the Planning Commission approved a site plan, that does not vest their rights in that zoning ordinance. You still have the right to change it. The case continues. A municipality must allow property owning and construction under a prior zoning classification where work of substantial character has already been completed. In this regard, preliminary operations such as ordering plans, surveying the land, and removal of old buildings are insufficient. Doesn't matter how much any given person has invested in a project, as long as they haven't got a permit and commenced substantial new improvements, largely to the exterior, so that it's impacting land use, they do not have a vested right. You can still enact a moratorium, you can still slow down and take your time to do your due diligence. It's absolutely your right under the law, but again, that's not legal advice because I'm not an attorney. What do I recommend? Most land use changes are pretty benign. And if we were here talking about changing your sign ordinance from 40 square feet to 45 square feet, some people wouldn't be happy, but in general, does it really make much difference? Not much. Wind turbines are a much different animal. We felt that the change of land use was so massive and the impact so profound that they should not occur without consent and compensation to all parties. Two-stage setbacks with a waiver option for both noise and distance require the developer to negotiate with everyone. It is fair and equitable. I would recommend using a conditional use approach. I don't remember if your ordinance has a conditional use process in there, but it very much should. That gives you, it's not a permitted use then, it's conditional. It allows you another layer of public hearings and negotiation to change locations and settings for the turbines, these kind of things. Now, a couple of my private thoughts. No one has ever come into a planning commission and said, the light coming through my windows is too steady, could you make it flicker? The nighttime noise level is too quiet, could you raise it to 55 from 25? My property values are too stable, could you build some 50-story industrial machines next door to put that value at risk? The old rule for zoning and dealing with developers of any kind, and this is well established in state law, you were here first, you get to decide. There are only two types of wind ordinances in operation in the state of Michigan. Wind developers always ask that ordinances are adopted that essentially award those free nuisance and safety easements across non-participants. Reasonable wind zoning demands that those easements be negotiated individually and privately between the developer and the impacted landowners rather than forced upon them by zoning regulation. Who decides? The wind developer prefers to place the difficult decision of do we let wind in or not in your hands, right here, and your township board. They want you to make the decision for the entire township. If you use two-stage zoning with large setbacks to non-participants and small ones to participants, then your community gets to decide individually and they can negotiate their price reasonably and fairly. And finally, I heard some discussion about what do the people in this township think about wind. We heard in the minutes some discussion about how many parcels were leased and so forth. You may recall in 2012 there was a ballot initiative called Proposal 3, and the goal was to amend our Constitution to require Michigan to generate 25% of their energy from renewable sources. Consumers in Detroit Edison and our group all opposed that. It was defeated statewide by 64 to 36%. However, we looked up the results. In Meade Township, it was defeated 76 to 24%. So this township voted even more strongly against Proposal 3 than the state did on average. And that's the end of my presentation.